Good evening, everyone. My name is Lorna Gozard, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Courtauld to our talk this evening for London Craft Week. I'm delighted to be able to say that we've got Stephen Witherford here to talk to us this evening. He's from Witherford Watson Mann, who have been the architects working on the incredible transformation of the Courtauld that's currently underway. Some of you may well be aware we are now scheduled to reopen on the 19th of November, so it's getting very close to our opening day, and Stephen will be able to, in his talk, hopefully really bring to life the transformation that's taken place and the way that traditional crafts have proved to be a key part of that. There will be time for questions at the end, so if you do have questions, because it is a webinar, if you could drop them into the chat, we should be able to chair and make sure that they're picked up at the end of the session. But now, without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Stephen.
Great, thank you very much, Lorna. And can you hear me okay? Is that I'm hoping you can. I've been asked to speak this evening about craft, and I searched the London Crafts Week programme by discipline, but I couldn't find construction listed. However, building construction is what I'm going to explore. I shall reflect on the construction of the initial phase of a project at Somerset House in London to support the transformation of the Courtauld Institute of Art. I noticed that many of the craft disciplines listed on the website were practiced by individuals or small studios of people who know each other closely and have great knowledge of the material they're working with. But I shall explore the nature of craft that emerges from not knowing exactly what material conditions you're working with or with whom you're working. Perhaps we might say how complete strangers come together to work with awkward and imprecise material in order to achieve precise outcomes. At the heart of this issue is the workmanship of risk. I shall begin with a short overview of the project, just to give you some context, which will then be followed by photos of things I noticed on site over about a 2.5-year period. I shan't say too much about each photo, other than perhaps to locate them or one or two insights, because in a way, I think the incidents captured are, at least many of them are quite beautiful because they have this capacity to communicate independently of words. So this is looking, and most of the drawn views are looking from the courtyard of Somerset House back towards the Strand block, the northern block of the complex, and beyond that is the Strand. And you can see at the center of that image are 3 openings, which is the vestibule, which takes you from the Strand through to the courtyard. The Strand block forms part of William Chambers' Georgian masterpiece at Somerset House. It's an unusual building. Things are certainly not always what they seem. It's 2 rooms deep in places, in others only 1. It's stretched out over 110 metres, which is just over 9 buses, with as much accommodation below ground as above. A road passes through its middle, which is the vestibule we just pointed to, and its rooms increase in size the higher up you ascend, culminating in the largest space located in the attic, the Great Room. The building presents a grand facade towards Somerset House courtyard. It's a sort of, this is an early etching from Chambers, and you can see it's got this kind of singularly palatial facade. Yet behind the facade, it was almost like a kind of, you can see from the plan below, and again, you've got the Strand at the north and the courtyard at the south of that plan, so it's organized the same way. You can see that it's more like a kind of folded terrace of Georgian houses. And each of those has got its own entrance and its own staircase. So the Strand block was originally constructed for a slightly random collection of learned societies and minor government offices. The red lines just show the way the building was divided up. Chambers drew on the grandeur and intimacy in the unified exterior and the divided interior. It's palatial in parts and domestic in others. The Strand block was designed to house 9 institutions, but it was also designed to separate them. So perhaps it would therefore be more accurate to say it took the form of an assemblage of disconnected suites of rooms. The Courtauld is a unique institution, half academic teaching in art history and conservation of artwork, and half art gallery. It moved into the Strand block after refurbishing it in 1989. You can see how the Courtauld appropriated Chambers' divided palace to house a largely divided set of departments. The poor linkages, contorted corridors, and almost 50 changes in level that existed between the old suites of rooms meant the visitors' and students' experiences were often confused and disjointed. At its simplest, our project has focused on creating a circuit for shared exchanges, linking together the suites of rooms so that all of the activities and the collections at the Courtauld can be encountered by students, staff, and visitors. This approach tunes the rooms for the current activities they accommodate, but it also leaves them open to be reused for different activities in the future. So we've sort of created a connective circuit, which has really involved focusing on access, connecting the suites of rooms, and transforming the galleries. So we connect across the second floor, bridging across the vestibule by creating new galleries from previously small cellular rooms. You can see that where the number 5 is largely on this. And we tunnel through the vaults that support the central section of the building, which is number 1 on that drawing, linking the east and west staircases. And therefore, bridging, tunneling, and connecting, new lifts as well, require making a few major interventions, but thousands of small adjustments. Everything is an intervention and everything is a one-off because the building is complex. It's riddled with inconsistencies following piecemeal adjustments over the last 240 years. The material we're working with remained concealed for much of the project. Our work has previously been described as gentle surgery, but this requires the deployment of the full range of interventions in the body: open heart surgery, keyhole surgery, and acupuncture, as you'll see. So what follows is the archaeology of a construction project. The various finds could quite possibly be reclassified and reordered. I noticed they don't match any of the craft disciplines defined on the London Craft Week website, but I hope you will feel how craft emerges from the conditions encountered and recorded below. Excavating. So this takes us through the initial works where we were tunneling through the vaults. If you remember there, the below ground section that sit below that vestibule and hold up the central section of the building. The emergence of the openings, connecting through those, starting to link the east and west sides of the building. And you get a sense of the extraordinary scale of intervention in order to remove some of the heaviest and sort of thickest parts of the fabric to create that tunnel below the vestibule. You can just see the score marks on the brick where they used a diamond tipped cheese wire to cut out some of the thickest areas of brickwork. We also had to lower important floor areas and in order to get level access through some of those lower levels. And you can see on the right the kind of things you'd never know were going to appear. That's a sort of medieval latrine which emerged partway through the construction, of which the archaeologists did their work and recorded their finds. Propping. Some areas of the Courtauld project have been likened to our project to stabilise and reoccupy the ruin Astley Castle for the Landmark Trust, only this time upside down. At the Courtauld, as you just saw, we worked underneath the supporting walls rather than on top of them. So the weight and balance of the thing you're operating on, this sedated body, becomes a constant presence. On the left, you can see when we took out the central section of the vault in the vestibule. We also had to construct a temporary road bridge so that vehicles could get into and out of the Somerset House courtyard to keep servicing events. So all of those movements, the vehicles were going on while the workmen were underneath, continuing to excavate. You can see here the existing brick vaults to the east and west of that central vault were retained and trimmed back, and then we cast the new central vault in concrete, which we'll look at later, into that existing brickwork. And these are the props holding that brickwork up. Enormous props and modest props. Improvised props. One of the extraordinary things about working in this way, intervening in a building of this kind, is just the incredible sense of gravity and weight that you experience. Propping to replace timbers that have rotted over time, and propping to hold up walls when you've lowered floors. We also propped the walls at high level where we removed the old cellular attic rooms. And this was to, in a way, take the place of what the old floor beams used to do in both holding the walls together and preventing them from falling in. This was part of an essential part of creating the new galleries on the second floor, which bridge across to the east staircase. Propping floors while you cut sections away to introduce level access and ramps. And propping old timbers so that you can strengthen floors to prevent vibration from the strand and the gradual destruction of the old stone floors. And this extraordinary find, which we encountered in the fine rooms at first floor, spans across the fine rooms. It's this huge roof truss, which is to put as little load as possible onto the vestibule and spread the load from above onto the two side walls. You can see on this section, so in the middle of that drawing, you can see the three arches of the vestibule, the road that goes through. Below that, the very dark section where we took out the vault. And poured in the concrete huge timber truss, forming the lantern of the great room. Cutting there was a lot of cutting, slicing through bricks walls to make new openings, cutting out old steels, cutting through timbers. Cutting all the new York stone to form new areas of floor for the public areas. And as we saw a little earlier, cutting through the huge masonry structures that support the central section of the building. And then the incremental cutting through one step at a time, the side walls with the maximum load comes down to piece in the new steelwork and concrete to support that central section and connect through the vaults. A new opening we cut through the great room into what become the new galleries to the east stair. And at a completely different scale, the cutting off of the noses of the old stone steps, you can see the ghost of them on the right. In order to create level access in the vestibule, we were able to remove the noses from the original steps, place them in a level plane in the same place, and make sure the historic stones stay where they had previously been. It was a way of kind of retaining that historic material on site. Forming. So this was a collection of the foam molds for the formation of the new concrete vaults. You can see the small drawn section on the bottom right of that drawing, which gives you a sense of how those go together. It's extremely tight. And you can see there's an enormous amount of steelwork in there. And then that road temporarily propped, carrying vehicles across all the time this was going on. It's extraordinary skill of making each form to suit the template of the bricks that were retained on those brick vaults either side to the east and west. And what this enabled us to do was to lift the height of the central vault so that we could get access right the way through the underneath of the building. And you get this beautiful echo from these vaults, which we designed to connect into the existing cross vaults of chambers brickwork. And you can see that echoed in the plaster vaults of the vestibule outside. So it's interesting how, in the end, we found these connections between the heavy masonry and the lighter plaster work that gets introduced as you move up through the building. Formers for new brick arches to connect into those vaults. And the formation of edges to create the openings in the new second floor galleries so that we could introduce some natural light from the roof into those spaces and echo in a sort of simplified way the way Chambers uses light in the lanterns of the great room. casting. This is the last preparations before the single pour of the central concrete new vault. I think this happened on the day before the very first lockdown. There it is. Once the formwork's been taken away and some of the propping, one single pour. A moment of great anxiety on site, because whatever it comes out as, that's what you've got to work with. You can see the cross vaults following into chambers to the left and right. And this was a rather beautiful encounter one Friday evening after walking around site. And I didn't understand why these small holes had been filled with pencils and paper. This is part of a new cantilevered stone staircase that we were constructing. And this was the answer. On the right is a section through that landing. And you can see those small holes going through to a larger hole in the center. And on the left, you can see the contractor explaining how you create a hole into that central one so that you can pour in your resin after you've set all the stones and lock them together. These are these beautiful little boats through which they introduce the resin. And on the right, a sort of similar but different process for anchoring the new steel balustrade into the edge of the stonework for the staircase. So this incredible sort of combination of a sort of improvisation and precision. And this was sort of an accidental pairing of images, this sense of both weight and lightness for the new concrete cross vaults that we had cast. And then on the right are these cast forms of fibrous plaster, which would form the new cornices in the new galleries at second floor. And you can see through Chambers's geometry and the language of those sections of ellipses, how they speak to each other. Embedding. This was the beginnings of the tread upon tread cantilevered construction for the new visitor staircase. So it's built into the brick wall directly. Each stone bearing on the other to take its load, so there's no beams or supports underneath. The embedment of those new vaults into the existing vaults. And that's not some form of cladding, that concrete is holding up the entire building. Piecing in. I guess after you've carried out these sort of large scale acts of intervention, the sort of open heart surgery, there's also many acts of piecing back in where historic fabric had previously been removed, or altered, and the new construction and the old are being brought together. These were rather beautiful. These were the original wood grain doors that we removed from the historic rooms and making and mending old ironmongery locations so they could be refinished, have all the new ironmongery fitted, and then finally wood grained again to be as close as we could match to the original. On the right was the beginning of connecting the new and old stones in the vestibule so that we could achieve a step-free access in that area. Piecing in areas of floor, piecing in areas of plasterwork. Piecing in New York stone floors to remaining historic floors. Piecing in new areas of plaster ceilings into the lath and plaster ones, where we've had to introduce strengthening or support for new fixtures and fittings. Piecing in existing and reclaimed floor material, where we've had to alter levels to get level access through. And that's the vestibule stone, where we've got two gentle ramps to the east and west. So the side aisles, east and west of the central vault, which we've removed and poured in concrete, reusing all of the old stones and then adding in the new edge stones, these solid pieces of Swedish limestone from the quarry that the original stones came from a couple of 100 years ago. Figuring out, well, that really was about that stone. So you can see on the right, these are the red and the grey Swedish limestone, and you can see the beautiful fossils in that. These were the original stones in the east and west side aisle of the vestibule. We think one of only 3 places that they were used in London, the others being Hampton Court and St Paul's Cathedral. So it was obviously a stone that was being touted around London at that time and presumably quite expensive, so used sparingly. And then on the left, you can see on the visit to the quarry where we encountered the red Siemens stone, you can see the same fossils. And that was about at the same level that these stones were originally taken from. And figuring out the actual grain of the stone, making sure it was cut along the bed and not across the bed. In the past, some of those stones have been cut the wrong way and they're now more fragile. Everything's numbered, carefully taken up, stored, and then once the works have gone on below, they can be relaid. And just agreeing the areas of that stone that were suitable to match the existing stones and those which were not. Coring out. Both at the large scale, again, and the small scale. That was the removal of some timber on the right in order to fit the new doors into the old openings. Coring out and testing the York stone to receive the new metal handrails. Taking out timber to receive new locks and security. Working the stone. That's the coring out of each of the notches to receive that metal balustrade. Threading through, there was a lot of that, mostly services. So this was a project which involved completely rewiring and resurfacing the whole building. New security, state of the art, cameras, means of escape, automatic opening doors, assisted doors for access. And this is the thing you'll never see, which was incredibly beautifully put in extremely tight locations. You can see here on the left, the old flues through the chimneys, which had been used to put ducts up historically. Old lead pipes in walls, in rainwater. All kinds of sort of voids and services threaded through this body. Millions of meters of new cabling. And on the right, threading a new lift through 6 floors in the west wing to provide access to all of those conservation studios. All the pipework in the ceilings and the plant rooms in the roofs. There was no generosity for any of those things, and everything we could gain for the spaces below was hard won. Threading huge new ducts to move air around the galleries, and cables through historic ceilings for new lighting and smoke detection. Approximations. These are some of our own testing mock-ups for cornice dimensions and lining heights to rooms that were going to become small galleries. Lining. There were some extraordinary revelations when we worked through the linings of this building. You can see here in the anteroom to the great room, chambers, original paneling, and the brickwork dividing the 2 galleries behind. And in some of the galleries, you could see sort of, well, a whole archaeology of paneling, the original gallery paneling from chambers, paneling that had been then installed across the face of that when the Courtauld moved in the late 1980s, and then newer paneling which had been installed in the last sort of 10 or 12 years for the new gallery walls. Paneling around old fireplaces. And you can see our work's also involved in tombing some of those fireplaces in location and the tight tolerances around that, so we could maximize the dimensions we'd have for the galleries. So this is the stud work, which then gets lined over. New linings to the great room. You can send so that the new paneling the cornices read as one. That's it. And then you can see on the right the fibrous plaster mold constructed, echoing the geometry of those historic ones. Seaming. These beautiful little cradles that were created by wiring through from above to support the historic plasterwork while repairs were carried out and new cables could be suspended through for the new lighting. This beautiful moment where the new fibrous plaster vaults were being positioned and leveled and lined through with these sticks and wires. This sort of strange combination of liquid levels, laser levels, and bits of wood and string almost. The seam along the edge of the central section of the vestibule with the old granite stones. Metalwork and the wreathed work taking the new handrail on that cantilevered stone staircase. Some repairs to the concrete pouring where the joints were in the formwork. Then the new glazing and louvers to do with the light control so we could reintroduce natural light again into the great room. A major transformation and an extraordinary act of intervention into those existing lanterns. Gapping. This was a really beautiful moment to encounter. These are the new oak floorboards, and we'd specified a penny gap between each board to allow for a little bit of movement and visual tolerance. And because you couldn't buy a spacer exactly the right size, the workmen had all been asked to go home and bring in all their loose change. It's so beautiful. New tiling in the visitor toilet area and the new sets being laid as part of the new access in the vestibule. Tracing, coming towards the end now. The new cantilevered stone staircase on the left, and historic services in some of the floors on the right. There's so much care in all of the setting out that happens in a project like this. Tracings of things removed, and then templates to create new things that are going to be installed into old openings, because they're all slightly different. Tracing of cornices and the tracing of wires to get to new lighting and new services. And the tracing of what lies beneath the floors that you're fixing to, because we fix through the surface into the joists below, and then the tracing of cracks and fault lines in the plaster. And this was something which I really couldn't believe how it was beautiful, which is the fixings tracing those joists below, which you'll never see, but are kind of echoed in the visible trace of the fixings on the oak. And finally, and importantly, communicating. We encountered a lot of these kind of drawings on site. Just workmen explaining to each other how different parts interfaced and came together. Someone working out the granite set joints and the curbs on the right-hand side. So there's a drawing for agreeing the setting out of all those metal plates that supported the brick vaults to the east and west of the central vault, and some very clear instructions drawn on those to get them out of the way so they didn't end up protruding through the finished concrete. Sometimes you just have to draw directly onto the material. It's the most effective and clearest way. And of course, being clear on what material goes into which void. So in conclusion, we can say that crafted construction is the result of something far more complex than performing a series of technical tasks or fully defined instructions. It would not be possible to completely define what is required of each task, as you might if you were, say, assembling a car. When you're intervening in an historic building, there are gaps in the collective endeavour, which the craftsman steps into. And this is where the workmanship of risk takes place, because you cannot completely define the outcome before you carry out the work. So I hope you can sense that at the intersections of the imagination, the deep knowledge of tradition, the wit of improvisation, and the body of skill and care, the conditions can be created for craft to emerge through negotiation rather than instruction. And I think in this sense, we might think of site-based craft as a combination of anthropology, demography, and languages, those spoken and those that don't have words. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Stephen. That was absolutely fascinating. Now, I know we had mentioned at the start about asking questions. Please do put questions into the chat. I can see we've already got one question there that I wanted to put to Stephen. So I'll start with,
When you were looking at what to preserve from the historic architecture and construction of the project, did the project try and preserve things like the later additions and adaptations made after the initial build, or was the intent to try and restore back to the late 18th century original style?
That's a very good question. I think largely it starts off with a very detailed assessment of the significance of the whole of the building that's left as it stands, and broadly going from red to green, things of the highest significance would be those that were all part of the original construction of the building, and they'd be red, and things that have come most recently in the last 20 years would be green. And you aim in many ways to ensure you don't undermine anything that's red, and you have a little bit more flexibility to work in things that are green. So that's part of the answer. What we tried to do was always work with rooms, because that's what we inherited, and the grain of the building. And as you can see, sometimes that did involve removing important original historic fabric in order to kind of really transform the way the building could be accessed and used. And in other areas, we were able to restore areas that had previously been undermined or damaged in some way. So there's this sort of interesting game between kind of restorative acts and, in a way, interventionist acts. And that's the sort of, I guess, that balance and that sort of those judgments are what hopefully allow this sort of new architecture within the old to sort of be having a conversation with it, rather than there being these awkward sort of standoffs where things don't talk to each other. And I think that's the judgment really which a lot of this talk is about, is how does that new stuff speak and converse and sort of whisper with the old.
Thank you. I've got another question here. What were some of the most surprising things the team encountered once the works got underway?
I mean, well, the medieval toilet was that was a big one. It took a little bit of time. Actually, I mean, there's different kinds of encounters. I guess this is a question of the encounter of the actual fabric we found. And I think we were surprised how much things had been altered, and how in the sort of what a piecemeal sort of set of alterations there were. So as I said earlier, everything really became a bit of a one-off, because you were dealing, you might be putting in 8 doors, but 6 of the openings were all sort of been altered differently. So you had to adapt to those situations. The other discovery that you find on a project is obviously the people. You don't know who you're going to be working with. You don't know the workmen until you meet them, and that's a different sort of discovery. But it's just as engaging, and you have to work with that discovery just as much as the fabric you find. And what this talk sort of really is about is you can't just tell someone what to do, because you don't necessarily know, and B, because they're not necessarily going to respond to that. You've got to work with all of those different nationalities who are working on the construction site, sometimes with or without a kind of shared language, and there has to be a lot of humility in that and sort of respect. And I'd say on this project, the respect between all of those different craftsmen and the sort of what's called the design team, who the services and structural and architectural teams that imagine this, and the construction and project management teams, the Courtauld internal teams, that sort of shared sense of respect and the kind of purpose was very strong.
Thank you very much. Also, a follow-up question. Was it easier to find the right expertise in terms of craftspeople for the various different needs? Was that an international search, or was that UK-based? Have you got a take on that, Stephen?
Well, I have to say, there were a few firms which we might have suggested from the design team's experience, but largely that came through the construction manager, which was Sir Robert McAlpines, who were very kind of well versed in a supply chain to tackle each thing. What was interesting on this project is there were a lot of small tasks. You know, you need a special contractor to do the wood graining on the door. You need a contractor who can do that little bit of glazing on that great room lantern and the louvers to control the light. You need a really specialist contractor who can repair the historic plaster, as we saw. So you've got a lot of people doing little bits of work, and that's all got to come together, as well as the bigger packages for joinery. Internationally, I mean, it's interesting, those companies, by the very nature of the workforce then, which is obviously changing a little bit, as we're all hearing now, were international. We had an incredible group of diverse nationalities working on the building, and they came really through those companies. And of course, when Chambers originally made the building, that was no different. The plasterers came in from Italy. We saw that vestibule side stone aisles that came in from Sweden. So this sort of, at least, you know, European exchange of material and craft has always been part of the kind of construction of London, really. And so this was just sort of a continuity of that.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think if there are no further questions, I'd like to thank you, Stephen, for your time this evening. I'd like to thank everybody for attending, albeit virtually, and remind everyone that the Courtauld Gallery will be reopening on the 19th of November, and tickets are on sale now. So please do come and see. Please do come and see the building for itself. I think you'll be absolutely delighted. So many thanks, and have a good evening.
Thank you.